Okay, episode 3. Zach Molloie, Mike Merola. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I think we'll start with some brief introductions. Who you are, where your career trajectory has followed over the last several years, and then we'll kind of talk a bit about what companies you're with now, what your role is, and go from there. Zach, you wanna kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Zach Molloie from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I went to Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. for undergrad, and then I stayed in the D.C. area with the George Mason University School of Law for law school. After law school, I spent some time in the civil division of the D.C. Office of the Attorney General, transitioned to a mid-sized litigation boutique in D.C., primarily supporting healthcare and technology companies who do business in the D.C. metro area. Grew my practice from litigation specific into more general business consulting, contracts employment, M&A. Really liked the business role. So I, from there, went to a large public healthcare tech company called Modivcare. And then spent some time at Modivcare. Really enjoyed, again, the being in-house and kind of the business aspects of that, and transitioned to the role that I'm in now, which is as general counsel at Peachy, which is a healthcare tech startup focused on wrinkle prevention.
Awesome. Great. Mike, how about you?
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey. I went to Franklin Marshall College, which is in Pennsylvania. Then I went to Harvard Law School. I came out of law school initially wanting to be a litigator. I joined a firm that was known for First Amendment rights called Cahill Gordon, but then I switched to corporate law, and I did Cahill for about 4 years. I did another large law firm for for about 4 years. I switched to a sort of medium-sized firm. I kept on trying to figure out what was going to work. And so I spent about 10 years at these law firms. I actually left the law for a few years. I went into wealth management, UBS, thinking that it was sort of a sales role, but thinking that as a lawyer I could add to the team that I was joining, which was basically selling alternative investments to endowments and pension funds. And I joined that sort of right around 2007, 2010. I was there. The market was brutal. I happened to be fortunate enough to meet a well-known developer in the restroom at this wealth management firm that I was working at. We shared an office space. His name was Bruce Eichner. Bruce had just been building the Cosmopolitan in Las Vegas. We got to know each other, and he said he was looking for a general counsel. I had no real estate experience, but Bruce was, gave me this opportunity. And I spent 7 years with him, learned a ton, sort of a huge learning curve on the real estate side. We were developing condos in Manhattan, up in Harlem. Just a great experience. I then went to another developer for about 5 years in New York. Then I joined a prop tech startup that was VC backed, thinking that this could be my chance to make some big winnings and learn the fate of a lot of these startups. So we struggled, and I left, and I've been at Article Student Living, which is a student housing developer for the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, Zach, tell us a little bit about what Peachy does. Maybe we'll dive a little bit deeper into the industry, the company, your role within the company, and the like.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it. So Peachy is an aesthetic startup focused on wrinkle prevention. It's grown pretty quickly. We're about 200 employees now. Peachy tackles wrinkle prevention through 3 main methods. One is daily use sunscreen. The other is the next one's prescription retinoids. And then the third one would be neuromodulator injections. I mean, most people know it as like Botox, but there are others that may work better for your individual features that make up your face, like Jeuveau or Xeomin or Dysport. Some of the things that set Peachy apart, I mean, unlike most of our competitors, we have a flat fee pricing model, which the clients really love. But I think the main thing that makes us unique is how we use AI and machine learning to build treatment plans for individual clients that take into account like the thousands and thousands of variables that make up your unique face. It's really helped us set ourselves apart in providing like the highest quality treatment for every client, every visit. So it's been really cool to be on the cutting edge of AI use and machine learning in the medical industry, and just if what we have right now is just a small taste of what it could become, we're in for a really incredible journey over the next 5 or 10 years in terms of AI use in the medical space. My role at Peachy, I'm a general counsel and the chief people officer. I'm Peachy's only legal hire, so I'm a legal department of one, which is very different from my experience at Modivcare, the large public company where it was a much larger legal team. When you're in-house, all of the departments of the company functionally are your clients, as opposed to when you're at an outside firm where you have individual clients. And so the business is my client functionally, which is really fun and exciting, particularly at a very fast-moving startup.
So, and you see this overlap a lot with legal and HR or the people operations function. Do you have non-attorneys supporting the HR function within Peachy, or is it largely? What does that function look like?
Yeah, so we have the people team is made up of mainly 3 parts, which is HR, talent acquisition, and then just culture generally. And yeah, there are non-attorneys that support the people function at Peachy that help out on that side. In terms of the legal, though, that's just a department of one me.
Got it. And Mike, tell us a little bit about Article Student Living.
Sure. So we are a vertically integrated real estate firm, which means that we develop, we invest, and we manage our properties. So we have about 45 properties across the country. We largely build privately in large universities, and then there's about over 20,000 beds. And so, like Zach, I'm a legal department of one. We have about 600 employees, about 100 on the corporate level, and then 500 out on the property management side. And as a general counsel, sort of work across business teams. So I think big part of being an in-house lawyer, and I think Zach was alluding to it as well. You're serving the business, you're serving your clients. So the clients really are just the business teams across the organization. So whether it's our development team, our investment management team, human resources, it's sort of, I structure it so that we're meeting on a regular basis, hearing the issues that they have, getting ahead of them, reacting to some, but hopefully also getting ahead of them on a proactive basis as well.
Mike, what I think is interesting about Article Student Living, particularly as it relates to the legal function, is it must be pretty different when you're handling legal matters for the corporate employees and legal matters for kind of property management, kind of boots on the ground, so to speak. Can you talk a little bit about how the legal work for those two functions may differ a bit?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, I think it's obviously on the when you're dealing with some of the property management issues, I think there's probably 2 distinctions. One, just the the employment issues that you might have. And there's a lot of them that come through the office, and then we're also just dealing with field issues too, right? So we actually own and operate buildings, and so we could have water damage, or we could just have many different types of issues that we confront on a daily basis, and it's sort of just working with different individuals out at the properties. I mean, mostly reporting up to the corporate level, but sometimes we'll interact with the folks down at the property level to address issues. And then obviously the corporate is just sort of what you'd expect on the corporate side, right? Which is, you're running a business, you're doing deals, you're trying to grow the business. So yeah, I think it's just different level of interactions and different types of communications that you have to be aware of.
You've both spent time at both small and larger companies. Zach, at Peachy, what did you see as the biggest difference? Obviously, you went from a department of many to a department of one. How is that touching your day-to-day?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically in-house generally is kind of about priorities, right? And sort of time and resources. I think when you're at a much larger company or have a much larger team, you have many more resources available to you than when you're at a smaller company. And how you utilize outside counsel depends pretty highly on your resourcing. And so I think that's probably the biggest difference, being at a large public company and then going to a smaller company or a startup like Peachy is, at a larger public company, you're relying on outside counsel almost for everything. in a lot of different ways. And then when you're in-house, you're at a smaller company or at a startup, you're basically the one doing a lot of the work as an individual contributor as well. And so how and when you utilize your resources to match up with a partner or partner with an outside counsel is, the decision making is much more intense.
At Modivcare, did you develop a bit of a niche, or did you start in a niche in terms of kind of a more specialized area of practice? And did you have discretion over when and how outside counsel was engaged? And then we can compare and contrast that with the time at Peachy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was primarily brought on to Modivcare to handle their nationwide litigation portfolio. I also worked in a bunch of their employment matters as well. But then I kind of expanded from there into compliance and general business matters and insurance. And there was Modivcare went through a huge round of acquisitions while I was there as well, growing from about 2,500 employees to about 40,000 employees. So worked a lot on the implementation and integration of the companies and sort of the back end of the M&A process. And so, yeah, it was just very different from Peachy, right? Again, where you kind of are at a larger company, you are kind of in a specific niche, right? You all on the team, you have kind of these specific things that you deal with on you have a very deep knowledge of, and you kind of own this subset of things. When you're a solo general counsel, and I'm sure Mike's experience is similar, you have to own everything. There is no subject matter that I could just pass off to another person, right? The buck stops with me. So you have to find the answer, whether it's going to outside counsel or independently.
And you guys both, I know, both your companies have national footprints. So you're highly aware of, or have to have your finger on the pulse of what's happening on a state and local level from an HR compliance perspective. Mike, how does that come up most frequently for you?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely on employment issues, right? Those are very state specific, so you need to be knowledgeable about them. And then on the construction side, we face it all the time too, right? There's different rules in different states about contractor lien rights, how we might address those. So we spend a lot of time, finding local counsel. It happens when we're buying real estate, we need to talk with local land use lawyers. If we want to have a change at the local level from a zoning compliance, we need to reach out to local lawyers. So, I mean, that is like, in some ways, the easiest place where you need to use outside counsel, because there's just no way that you'd have that knowledge. And fortunately, we have also the law firms that we work with obviously are well connected. So even if it's in a smaller town, they usually can find us to someone that they know that's competent and to help us out in those types of situations. Yeah,
I was going to ask, I mean, has a strategy been, or have you used both large and small law firms, kind of larger firms that have footprints a little bit more broadly geographically, or do you, how do you manage?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of times it ends up being there's certain matters that I think one actually probably get handled better by smaller shops, and then also from a cost perspective, it's better for the company to utilize them. So certainly, like on a land use attorneys, we do regular reviews. So we have properties across the country. Our leases need to be compliant with the state. We use a roster of local lawyers, and that's obviously just better small firm. And I think sometimes some of the large firms don't even provide that level of service, and so they'll refer. And I think it's interesting because a lot of these, we work with some great large firms, and I think they're always actually cognizant of our costs too. I don't think anyone wants to see a client paying more than they have to, so they'll say, don't use us for this. They'll recommend someone that's better price for what we're looking for. So I think that's how we typically tackle it.
Mike, talk a little bit about how you got into real estate law. I mean, I know it was a bit of fortuitous sort of events, but I mean, talk about what that experience was for the first 12 to 18 months. I mean, obviously, it was just kind of happenstance, but let's talk about it a little more.
Absolutely, yeah. So it was as I said. So I was in wealth management about 2010, and there was obviously in the Great Recession. And I had left the legal field, and actually sometimes I feel like you were sort of reflect on what you were doing. I was like, I enjoyed it more than I thought I did when I left it, but I was sort of looking to mix it up. And so I wanted to get back into the law, but actually leaving the law, at least back then, I think employers are more flexible now. But I think back then, like when you leave the law, it was sort of like you're out of the law, right? Getting back into it was challenging. And so I was exploring those opportunities. And then I met this developer, Bruce Eichner, and as Bruce and I just started chatting, he started asking me some views on certain projects that he was looking at, more on like sort of corporate, like buying debt, but not like real estate. Obviously, I had not done any real estate. And then he was the kind of guy who just worked on instinct. I mean, he was successful, and he just said, I'm going to start reconstitute this team. You want to join? So I did. And then, the first 2 years was like a huge learning curve, but it was super invigorating, right? I mean, it's like everything you learn every day is new. And he's a super high energy personality. So it was, you knew you needed to know your stuff. And I mean, I think it was exhilarating, actually. We're like buying properties. I think real estate's exciting because it's tangible, right? You're actually seeing something that results from your work. And so we were putting together a development on 22nd Street in Manhattan, buying air rights, putting together the contracting team and the consultants. And, all of a sudden you're demolishing a building, you're going out of the ground, and you're actually building, putting something together, and you're looking for the financing to put it together. And so, it was a super huge learning curve, but it was dramatic too, right? And just in terms of how quickly I had to learn it, and obviously grateful for the experience.
How'd you pick it up? Were you relying on, it was a mix of kind of self-taught, outside counsel partners, just learning by osmosis through conversation and working with colleagues?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it was a combination of, I had seen some of it before, right? So I was originally like on the financing side. I had the experience on the financing side. I did work a lot with outside counsel early on, sort of leverage that relationship. And then, just sort of reading on my own, bought some books, just like I would Google these things, hey, how does this normally work out? And then I had, friends that I would call, right? Because obviously I didn't want legal fees to get out of control, but friends who had this experience, and just sort of, just dove into it. And I think the one other piece of it was a small company, right? So I spent, worked a lot on like the business models themselves, right? So understanding like what you were doing, like the big picture of like the business model made it easier to absorb the legal side of it, because sort of knew where we were trying to take the company.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, and Zach, at Peachy, I know you're having to get really familiar, well versed in what's happening on AI. Obviously, top of mind and a lot happening there. I mean, what's been your experience with picking that up, or getting smarter on that field, and particularly how it touches your legal role?
Yeah, I mean, that's been really fun. I touched on that a little bit a couple times in my career, and it's just a personal interest of mine as well. So it's been really cool to like really be able to dive into it on a professional level really deeply. Our tech team here at Peachy is incredible, and they worked with our founder, Carolyn Treasurer, to like utilize her medical knowledge to build this sort of like robust machine learning platform that can really study all of the individual facial features and musculature of an individual's face. Because I mean, I'm not a doctor, but there's thousands and thousands of variables that go into the musculature of all of our faces. And if you're a provider and you're, providing particularly like aesthetic treatments, and you're not, acutely aware of all of those variables, which how could an individual person really, make those calculations on for every single face that they see, it's difficult to provide a standardized service, right? So the AI smooths over that process in a really interesting way, and building out these treatment plans that then our nurse practitioners can dive into and make small edits to as based on the client's needs. And it's been really fun. And I think to touch on something Mike said too, I think one of the things that is so important transitioning in-house is you don't realize how deep of an understanding of the business you actually need. I mean, like the more you can dive into the business and understand the bigger picture and the business fundamentals, the more effective you can be in counseling your business leaders. I mean, if you just go into the scenario, you don't really understand the business, you don't understand the big picture, or alternatively, that you don't understand business fundamentals, the words that are going to be thrown around in the boardroom or an executive leadership meeting, it's just really difficult for you to be able to influence the conversation in a way that you really want to as a C-suite executive.
So Peachy is selling the program or the treatment plan and using AI to do that, and then the implementation of that plan largely with pre-existing treatment plans, and kind of how is that touching your day-to-day?
Yeah, so in terms of the day-to-day, I think the tech team primarily handles the day-to-day kind of operations of the function of the algorithms. But in terms of how we got there, so it was less of my day-to-day. I mean, the building process was more incorporated into my day-to-day. With all of the needing to get the technology patented and working with the tech teams and the founders to really understand it, so I can communicate it to outside counsel. This is exactly how it's built. Yeah. This is exactly what I want. This is how we want to explain it to the patent examiners. This is the IP protection that we want, both in this module and sort of broadly. And that took a fair amount of time. With regard to the regulatory structure in the United States, it's still pretty slim. I mean, individual states have some frameworks that they're working with, mostly from a privacy perspective. But there's not a lot in the US now. And compared to Europe, where, they're doing a lot of things in AI and making the marketplace fairly constrained. We haven't had that in the United States. So it's still pretty much like the Wild West, if you will, in developing this stuff. But you can match with individual state frameworks for privacy and make sure you're compliant in that regard. And we'll kind of see as it continues to develop in the US, what other regulatory and compliance issues will come up. And then, I'll have to kind of dig back in, if you will, and make sure that we're meeting those expectations.
Where are you seeing things going on trend for AI meets, legal practice, regulatory environment? What are you seeing at a state level that could be implemented nationally?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think the privacy is just really kind of what you do with the data that you collect, I think is probably a primary concern for lawmakers right now. And we're seeing that in Europe very, very heavily. And then you start to see it crop up in California first, right? And then it starts to kind of make its way across the country. That seems to be where the main kind of meat of the regulatory sort of viewpoint is right now, is how do you collect data? How do you store that data? How do you use that data? And then how do you communicate to the people whose data you hold, what you're doing with it, what the storage capabilities are, their ability to say don't use my data, right? And things of that nature. I think if I was going to forecast what might happen on a federal level in the next 5 to 10 years, I think that's probably the first thing that would happen. They may go beyond that. They may not. I think some of the big players in AI, Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg are kind of pushing for additional constraints on AI. But I think we'd probably see it from a privacy first angle.
Yeah, Mike, what are you doing to stay on top of changes in your industry, changes in the regulatory environment? What's top of mind for you?
Yeah, I think it's sort of we have a fund, for example, so I'm keeping up to date on what's happening on a federal level on a fund. So and then there's employment issues that are constantly getting updated. A lot of it's relying, frankly, the outside counsel that know that we're in this space, and they're passing along new information or new legislative or regulatory action. Trying to think how else I keep up to date. I mean, frankly, just reading the real estate industry rags, Real Deal or those kind of things to know what's going on. But yeah, there's a constant evolution. So just trying to weed out that information from the people that you work with is usually how I approach it.
Yeah. And your stakeholder relationships, you both have close contacts with the HR function, which we've talked a bit about. Where are you seeing yourself spend most of the time? Who are you working most closely with? What's been effective in communicating with those folks, building those relationships? Zach, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very close with the HR team, considering I lead the people team at Peachy. So like we have daily contact about a variety of different things, right? On the TA side, on the HR side, and community building, and the culture committee here at Peachy. In terms of staying up to date, to touch on something that Mike just said, I mean, I think, one of the more challenging aspects, like regulatory aspects of running a nationwide business, is just the employment relationships in every single state. I mean, they're all handled differently, sometimes even like on a more local level than a state, like an individual city, for example. Like New York City has different rules from New York State, for example. And so how you build say an employment manual under those circumstances, particularly when you have different classes of employees, like Mike has with kind of local employees and corporate employees, and Peachy has corporate employees and local employees in all of these states as well, really becomes like top of mind for like compliance and building sort of a how you're going to work from an HR perspective. I say for a national brand, that's absolutely one of the key features of developing a legal function.
How have you done it at Peachy? In terms of, why don't we start with kind of a handbook, and how you built that over time? What you found to be worthwhile in terms of implementing practices to keep it efficient?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because we're handling it very similar to how I handled the process at Modivcare as well. We work, similar to what Mike said, we work closely with outside counsel in the employment realm because in large part, it's like very hard to be an expert on every city or state rule in the entirety of the United States, right? For one person to be that expert. So working with local counsel where we have business units is really helpful in kind of building out these nationwide employment manuals. It's really, there are a couple different directions you can go in. Like I said, we had a similar process at Modivcare. We had employees in all 50 states. And you can go kind of a general route where your employment manual tends to be on the longer side. You can go on a kind of a more truncated route where you have maybe a shorter employment manual and then individual state supplements or local supplements in different in different cities or states or for different employee classes. That tends to be a way that a lot of businesses handled it. That's how we handled it at Modivcare. And for Peachy, luckily, we're not quite to 50 states yet. So I don't have to worry about that quite yet. Eventually, yes, but not quite yet. So we've been able to keep one employment manual with a couple state supplements and keep it relatively lean while still conveying the information. But as we continue to grow, it's going to be an additional challenge for us to grapple with at scale.
Mike, what does that look like? Where you are in terms of building the HR function, managing a handbook. What have you found to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think same challenges that Zach faced. You sort of have to get into the local laws, work with counsel to create a handbook that addresses the local regulations. I mean, I think one of the big challenges of being general counsel is sort of how you process information too. So I think this sort of goes to a larger point, right? Because there's always I think everyone has that when you become a lawyer, I think you sort of have this view that you've got to get into the weeds, know everything about everything. And when you're the general counsel, you can't do that. You just don't have the time to do that. So there's one question, obviously, about how you're prioritizing your time. But even when you have the time to dig into something, it's sort of how are you sort of getting the juice out of the information so that you can respond to it quickly. So like on these employment issues, I mean, I really am relying on outside counsel, but then they'll come to us on a policy question because there's some ability to craft the policy. There's decision making that goes into it, right? So I think at that point, when you're getting that information, how are you tackling it? I'll work with our head of HR, and we'll sort of come together to reach a conclusion. I think that's the other piece of the process too. I mean, it's always better to make the process as inclusive as possible, particularly for the folks that actually have to enact these things. So easy for you, Zach, right? Because the person enacting it, I guess, is you. But I think, but I think in other areas, it's always. I mean, that goes beyond HR, right? So I think just going back to an earlier question you had too, I'm gonna have weekly calls with different departments and because it's just an acknowledgement that these legal decisions are not made in silos, right? It's really just always impacting the business.
Yeah.
How do you guys like to stay involved with the various teams that you work with? I mean, Mike, you just said like weekly call is a good way of doing it. Zach, what are you doing at Peachy to just keep those points of contact with your colleagues?
Yeah, similar with Mike. I mean, we do weekly calls, particularly for employees who are spread out across the U.S. I mean, I'm regularly meeting with employees in our offices, who run different departments or different business units. You really do have to keep in close contact because, as Mike said at the beginning of the call, it's they are your clients when you're in-house. The leaders of the business units are your clients. And so, you're supporting the business growth through the different departments, and you need to stay on top of what their priorities are, what their goals are, and try to help them achieve those goals. I mean, I think, I learned very quickly at Modivcare that if you are kind of like the legal department can often be, or historically has been viewed in corporate environments as the department of no, right? The business says, I want to do this thing. And you go like, no, too risky, or like, can't do it. I had some great mentors at Modivcare who were very quick to point out that doesn't work here, right? And it really doesn't work generally in-house. You need to be flexible, and you need to help the business achieve those goals and help mitigate risk along the way. So unless it's purely like flatly illegal or flatly unethical, then the answer is, okay, let me help you get there, right? Or here's how I think we can get there by minimizing some of the risks that I see. And it's really a continuation of the conversation. So you need to have constant contact with your business units. You need to figure out what their goals are. You need to get embedded with them so that you can help them achieve those goals. That's really how you find success in-house.
Mike,
I'm sorry. Right. No, I was going to say, I think that's a great point, because I worked when I was out of the smaller shops, particularly like developers always want to find a way to get to the answer. And I remember working with one developer, and actually wasn't a legal person, but anyone who told him, no, you can't do that, it just drove him crazy, right? I mean, the first answer should be like, yeah, let's see how we can do it. And then maybe it is no. But yeah, starting with no, I agree with you, is like the worst answer.
Yeah.
And going back to kind of what we learned in law school when we're writing our first memos, what's the issue? What's the conclusion? And it's yes because or no because, right? There's no like probably or like maybe if we really care about that or this. Yeah. When in practice, that's really typically what the answer should be, or at least that's probably the most appropriate answer based on what the business context is. When you're participating in those business decisions, one, I mean, what's worked for you with communicating with the business folks? Where do you see yourself feeling most comfortable? How do you kind of merge, the business input with your legal input, those types of things? Mike, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have a general position to defer to the business teams on exactly how they want to take a particular path forward. Even if it's something as we're in a dispute with someone, and I sort of want to hear how they want to handle it, even though ultimately it could become a litigation matter. But I think the role of the lawyer is sort of like appreciate sort of the risk assessment aspect of it, and to see which paths that we're exploring, and what kind of risk it poses to the company. But yeah, so I think it's more, deferential. I mean, rarely, but sometimes it does happen where you say, no, this is a plain reading of the language. You can't get around what it says, and we gotta do this. But try to obviously really defer to the business teams.
Zach, how about you?
Yeah, exact same way. I mean, I just echoing Mike's sentiments almost exactly. I think, I like to present the specific risk profiles in like options to my business leaders. I think that's been really helpful to help them like wrap their head around what the risks are, potential risks are associated with like a path that they take along that decision tree to reach their goals. But yeah, I think, ultimately I defer to the business, and, you rarely, like Mike said, you rarely have to just flat out say no. Most of the times there's a way to kind of get to that business goal. You're just kind of helping to guide the business along and trying to mitigate risk as you go forward.
When you're characterizing risks, identifying that risk profile, what's your approach to that? And in the past I've used kind of this, likelihood of occurrence and magnitude of potential damage, and where do we fall on that, with high likelihood, high magnitude being the riskiest. That's where we're most conservative, low likelihood, low magnitude. We can be a little more aggressive. What types of strategies do you use along those lines?
Yeah, I try to be as data driven as possible. I think that that's like one of the best ways to communicate with business leaders. They're constantly relying on data to make decisions, at least at Peachy. And so if I can speak the same language that they speak, then that's like an easier way for us to make a joint decision. So I try to find as much data as I can to categorize into those those frameworks that you just presented, Brian. That's exactly how I present it to my business leaders. Again, just trying to utilize as much data as I can to present the case.
What kind of data do you use?
Well, I mean, it depends on the circumstances. If it's like, if it's a scenario where it could potentially go to litigation, right, or it's a regulatory action, right, I'll pull previous cases, or I'll pull previous like regulatory action, enforcement action, things of that nature, to try to build the scenario for like, if this is a likely outcome, or the percent chance that this happens, like this is a likely outcome in terms of magnitude. And so you just try to utilize as much data as you have available, understanding that like nothing is perfectly mapped out, right, in terms of the analytics, particularly in the law, or else we wouldn't have jobs. But you just try to rely on it as much as you possibly can, so that you can, at least present, a probable case or a likely case, right? Like you said about as law students, I think, probably and likely are key words I rely on a daily basis.
Right.
Which in law school are, forbidden.
Yeah. Mike, characterizing risks, risk profile.
Yeah, I think
what's your approach?
Yeah, I think, very similar, right? It's always sort of like starting, on terms of really what are the dollars at stake if you're looking at a litigation, and then there's obviously there's not just dollars, there's reputation. Is it a one-off? Is this something that we're doing in other cases? And so if we're reaching an agreement here, how does that impact in other cases? But yeah, generally it's just sort of very data driven, and it's just looking at, frankly, the dollars and the impact of the dollars to the business.
Yeah. You both have remote teams to an extent. Yeah. How we talked about the HR compliance on a state and local basis, talked about some of the regulatory compliance obligations, land use, that are more local specific. In this kind of post-pandemic era where remote work is more common, how are you seeing that, if at all, coming through your businesses and hitting your day-to-day? Zach, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think it flows really well at Peachy. We have like half of our corporate team, we'll say, is remote, and it works quite well. It just depends on kind of like the individual and the teams, but primarily, for example, our tech team is remote, and they're probably the most organized team out of anyone at Peachy. I mean, the way that their workflows are incredible. I mean, they I mirrored a lot of my workflows off of their workflows, because they're just very concise and they work very well. And so, I think remote work can definitely work. It might take a little bit more work to be that level of organized, such that you're you're working at that level of efficiency with a remote team, and you can't just pop into someone's office and chat about it. But but if if you're good at it and you're organized enough and the willpower is there, I mean, it's like I said, it's worked great at Peachy. I've seen it work great at other organizations as well. And so we've really embraced remote work.
What tools are you using? With the technology team's workflow and how you've adopted it, what are some of the strategies that have worked for you?
Yeah, so at Modivcare, we have remote teams too, and we didn't have like a great way of tying everyone together. But at Peachy, we utilize a tool, kind of a joint organization tool. It's called Notion. And basically, like, everyone can edit documents kind of simultaneously. And it's really, and you can embed videos and all kinds of like really interesting workflows in Notion. And so we store kind of as like a knowledge base all of our corporate knowledge in our Notion team space. And it's been a really great, particularly by comparison to a little bit more like disaggregated way that it was approached at Modivcare. It's been really great to kind of tie us all together.
That's interesting. So can you use or kind of tie your use of Notion to a specific use case, provide an example of like what you use Notion for in the day-to-day?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I use it in the legal function to bring it back. It's like I use it for like contracting workflows, right? Like I'll have my contracting workflow, like the questions that I'll want a business leader to answer if they're going to pass a contract along to me to review, so that they can do a lot of those things themselves, right? Like, what do I want them to look for in a contract? What are our contracting values as an organization, so that they can kind of take the first stab at evaluating the contract that they get from a vendor, and can propose things to me based on what our core values are, as opposed to me having to review a contract from scratch and then have these individualized conversations with each and every person every time a contract comes up. So, the whole company has access to that. So as they want to pull in a contract or they want to start a new relationship with a vendor, they'll pull up the contracting guidelines, they'll review what they are in light of the contract they have in front of them. They can answer a lot of the questions and then push the ticket along to me for the next step. That's been very fruitful in terms of our efficiency. And there's a lot of sort of use cases like that.
Mike, how about you? What do you guys use in improve efficiency in your end?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, I've used those type of the Notion in startup world, and in the company I'm with now. I mean, more of it's happened organically. Frankly, we just I think it's a lot of meetings, a lot of calls. I mean, it does definitely take a little bit longer. I mean, we do use Asana for like one of our groups to share work ideas, but a lot of it's sort of been, I think just a lot of accessibility. So I think just making, I get emails from across the organization on calls. I mean, and just sort of has happened more organically. I think even to the point where sometimes you do these Zoom calls or Meets calls, and then you see someone in person and it's the first time, but you actually feel like you don't realize it's the first time, right? Because you've just been in dialogue for so long. So it's worked well, but we don't have like any sort of, set strategy on how to tackle it. Yeah.
So Zach, at Peachy, how are you making sure that you're kind of keeping your finger on the pulse of, particularly, the HR team? I mean, as we're talking about kind of remote workforces, scaling, trying to find efficiencies, there's a lot of kind of disjointed pieces, or at least dispersed pieces in both your businesses. What's been a challenge for you, and how have you tried to address it?
Yeah, I think the challenge generally is just, I think a disaggregated workforce generally is just a challenge, right? It's not a challenge without a solution, but it does require like very meaningful interactions, right? Whereas if you're all in the same office together all the time, and you don't have like, Peachy basically has functionally studios, basically retail locations in a bunch of these different states. And so, it's very different from having just an office full of people that you can just, go to talk to someone when you want to. So you just have to be significantly more intentional about how you're approaching information sharing, how you're approaching corporate culture, how you're disseminating information, communicating information back and forth. To Mike's point, sometimes it just does require more effort, right? Like sometimes you have to reach out more often. You have to be more intentional with your reach outs in order to really bridge that gap. Otherwise, I mean, one of the main concerns is that if you don't do it well, or you don't do it often enough, or you don't dive deeply enough on your reach outs, you're not getting the information that you need to be able to help, or make changes, or understand the goals of that business unit. And so that's certainly a disaggregated workforce is a challenge, but if you can make it work, it certainly opens up a bunch of options talent wise that that otherwise you wouldn't have available.
Yeah, Mike, how about you? What's happened on your end that's really worked?
In terms of just bringing together the different
aggregated it's kind of dispersed workforce, and really kind of keeping some continuity across the organization. Really, as that kind of the legal function rolls up to you make sure everyone is staying on the same page, at least in that one regard.
Yeah, I think it's as an executive team, we meet on a weekly basis. We have a lot of sort of culture building programs at our company that brings people together. So a lot of it's sort of other departments do spend a lot of time focusing on how we can create that cohesion. So I work for a company that's based in Chicago. I live in New York, but I fly in on a regular basis. And so I mean, a lot of like culture building is just building that rapport. And so, I mean, I've noticed it in my own time there, right? Where like, you know, the first few times you're showing up is sort of, you know, you're the new guy, right? You don't know anyone. And then now, like, I sort of like when I show up in Chicago, it's sort of like I could be walking out my door in New York going to work, right? It's so seamless now that and I think that's probably just partly a function of time too. I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't put in the effort to make sure you're making you know, contacts and that you're not participating in the culture, but just there's an element of just that it sort of naturally happens. And again, I think it's also just sort of, I think from the legal department too, and I try to like, because I think like in a companies, people either don't know what the legal function really does, or there's a fear of the legal department. And so just from like a personality, like sort of trying to make the legal department have a personality within the company. I think like making it accessible, making it a resource, and wanting people to come if they've got questions or don't understand something. So I try to encourage that as best as possible.
Zach, what strategies are you? Because that's definitely something you hear a lot among general counsel. It's just, you know, everyone has a preconceived notion of lawyers and the legal department and the Department of No. And so what have you used to try to break down some of those barriers?
Yeah, I think, you know, Mike's spot on. You know, I think probably most people, like their average everyday lives, like encountering a lawyer is bad, right? So it's not great. So they, you know, building that rapport, you know, across the organization is key. I mean, it's a key point if you want to be successful in an in-house role, you know, in any in-house role, but particularly as general counsel. I mean, you really do, if you're breaking down kind of an incentive structure, you want people to come talk to you early and often, right? I mean, that's really what you want, so that you can help move the organization in the right direction. And if they're waiting until something bad happens to come talk to you, it's too late at that point. And, you know, you're on the back foot and it's a problem. And so, you know, finding opportunities to build a rapport, to, you know, show people that coming to you early is an advantage and you're there to help and you're there to support them and their goals, is an absolute priority for me. And I think if you want to be successful in an in-house role, it needs to be a priority for you as well.
I mean, it can be tough. It can be a tough sell as an in-house lawyer. If you come to me, business person, earlier on, it might cost you an extra 30 minutes or an hour at the outset, but we just saved 3 hours a month and a half from now if you didn't come to me at the outset, because we could avoid, you know, the path that you're about to go down that may not be, you know, the most advisable path, but it's not the path of least resistance, right? It's seeking counsel at the outset that can introduce some friction early, but if you can communicate that the friction early on really saves quite a bit down the road, it can be effective in my experience.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, this goes back to a point that Mike made earlier too. You know, sometimes in the business, or a lot of the time in a business context, it really comes down to dollars and cents, right? So I think all of us can point to things that happened in our business that like maybe didn't go the way that we wanted them to go, right? And if you weren't involved in one of those exchanges, but yet you controlled it on the back end, you can very easily point to the use cases to why, like, hey, maybe next time it'd be great if you came to talk to me in advance, so we didn't have that outcome that we had that we didn't like, right? And so, you know, sometimes it's about, you know, particularly for business units that might be a little slower to adapt to coming to you in advance, you know, you might have to find some of those use cases to be, you know, to have a more data-driven approach as to why that extra 30 minutes or half, you know, or hour, you know, ultimately will be to their advantage. And I think the other part is being able to speak the business fundamentals, right? No, just being able to speak the business fundamentals, I think is important, right? Because, you know, that just helps kind of open that door for them to come talk to you. It's not just a conversation about legal, it's a conversation about how we can get to their goal, you know, faster, more efficiently, you know, less expensive, perhaps, you know, avoid some of the pitfalls that might otherwise be there.
Mike, strategies you've used to get folks to come to you a little bit earlier. How's that worked in your practice?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's sometimes it's a challenge, right? I mean, I think you got to sort of like, I think one, if you join a company that sort of has a history of doing things a certain way, right? You sort of got to change that culture, introduce yourself. I think sometimes, so sometimes people either, you know, don't know that they should go to legal on certain items, right? So you sort of have to have that education of let's share everything with legal. It'll be quick, right? I think, and then there's this element of like, it's going to slow down the process. I don't want to slow it down, right? So I think just working on, I mean, it's a constant challenge, right? But response time from the legal department. So like getting back to people as quickly as possible so that it doesn't get caught up, right? Because I think they want, they're trying to move something forward, and again, I think to your point earlier, it will save time in the long run, but that term holdup is frustrating for them, right? So just being cognizant of like moving things along, and then I think it's also just and then there's a flip side of that where I think sometimes people sort of are too concerned about an issue or too deferential to legal, and sort of you sort of have to educate them on that piece of it too. Just say, hey, this is it's okay to do that. You're fine. So I think it's just it's repeating myself, but it's communication and getting that education across.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many times when you don't get pulled in as legal early enough because maybe the business person hasn't identified this as a legal issue. And so the better job that we can do is communicating, hey, this is kind of how your business issue might run into legal and how we can help or help avoid some future risk. Is just that education can certainly be effective. Switching gears a little bit to, I mean, you both have gone through a certain level of kind of rebranding at your companies, I believe. Zach, can you talk about kind of what you've done at Peachy or Modivcare on kind of how you've the company is expanded or made a transition in some area and how that's impacted your role?
Yeah, sure. So Modivcare is a great example of this. Modivcare went through a huge round of acquisitions shortly after I joined. Like I said, grew from about 2,500 employees to roughly 40,000. And so, particularly incorporating private companies into a public company is a very big culture change. And the company really worked very hard to communicate to kind of each of the incoming groups, our corporate culture, all of the aspects that they would need to sort of get onboarded appropriately. But it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. I mean, not just at Modivcare, but just generally, you see it in the market constantly when organizations go through a round of acquisitions or acquire another company. The deal is like the easiest part of it, right? The integration and implementation. Yeah, the integration and implementation on the back end is probably one of the more challenging business functions you bump into. In general, I mean, there's cultural issues, there are employment issues, there are, just building out new workflows, new management structures. I mean, it can be very, very challenging. We're kind of harping on the same points here, but communication really is key in these scenarios, right? Being intentional in your communications, being as broad as possible in your communications such that you're bringing in all of the participants. Just being very, very intentional about the process is really the key to success. I mean, and even under those circumstances, it's challenging, but the stronger you are in your communication efforts, the better off you're going to be at the end of the day.
Mike, what's been your experience?
Yes, very similar. I mean, I think the communication is key. I mean, in my prior company may even be a better example. I joined a startup. I was a 7th employee. I was the general counsel. So everything was sort of, new, right? So we were setting up new processes. We're putting in, everything was sort of like, there's a lot to be done. And how do you tackle that? Corporate governance was a big part of it. What was our structure going to look like? Even like in an organization, in a startup, like who can sign what, right? Who has the authority to sign documents? And that sort of becomes like everyone sort of wants to get stuff done. Who has the, and it's a big part of actually sort of protecting the company too, right? Because you want to make sure that only the right people can sign documents. Then it's putting together the new policies from an employee perspective. It's putting together all your legal templates, right? So we particularly like it's on a startup basis, and I'm sure Zach has this too. There's a lot of deal exploration, so NDAs are a big part of it. What does your NDA template look like? We spent so much time on our NDAs and making sure that they were right, and then we had other other templates that we were putting together. So it's just a lot of again, I think it's the could be the exciting part, and was for the most part of like just sort of doing something from scratch, because you don't have to correct your prior errors. You just have a chance to do it right from day one.
I mean, it's been a great conversation. You both have been in companies that have been dynamic, changing, expanding, getting into acquiring companies, and that I'm sure has pushed you as attorneys. We wrap up each episode with advice that you give to yourself when you were starting out in your career. Mike, what would you really what would you have liked to have heard when you were getting started that you've learned since?
I do think about that often, actually, but I think one is that and it's almost impossible, I think, for someone to take this lesson in. I'm not sure I would have, but if I was open-minded enough, I think it's just that your career wouldn't be a straight line. It's just sort of got to go with sometimes where it takes you. And I think it's I think there's this desire to be settled and know who you are and know what you're doing. And I don't think that's a necessity. I think actually, looking back, if I had just told myself, as long as you're learning and growing and accumulating knowledge, you're going to be fine. I mean, I think sometimes, I remember working at corporate law firms and just being overwhelmed by the work. And I think if I just looked at it a little bit more incrementally and just realized I was learning and it was going to take me to some place, I probably would have been a happier young lawyer. But yeah, I think that's it. And it's cliche to say it always works out, because maybe it doesn't. But I think there is an element of just just keep on moving forward and growing and learning, and then hopefully it falls into place.
Great. Zach, how about you?
Yeah, that's a great life lesson, Mike. And I think that mine piggybacks off that a little bit too. It's just you get comfortable with risk, with some measure of risk. When you're at a law firm, you're incentivized to basically give the most conservative possible advice to your clients, right? Because if you do X, Y, Z, the way that the law says, you'll never go wrong, right? But you can't do that. You can't do that when you're, in-house. The business, doesn't want to hear that. That's kind of how you fall into being the Department of No. So you need to get comfortable with some measure of risk, and having the organization take some measure of risk. And if you can get really comfortable with that, you'll be really successful, in your career, and also, to Mike's point, probably in life. I mean, you need to just kind of be able to build these competencies over time, get comfortable with the risk involved, and you'll be all right at the end of the day.
This is great. Thank you both for coming on episode number 3. This is a great conversation. We'll leave your contact information in the notes on YouTube, and feel free to reach out, add some comments on YouTube, and thanks again for coming on. It was a really good conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.